Without further ado, let me start by introducing our first panelist, Erin Stern. Erin is a qualitative research specialist focused on informing and evaluating gender and health programs. She holds honorary assistant and associate professor positions within the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as the University of Cape Town, respectively, and is a senior associate with the Prevention Collaborative. We were so lucky to have Erin hold the pen on this one and work so closely with practitioners to document their practice-based insights and really put it in conversation with the evidence on the same. So Erin, over to you for giving us a brief presentation of the key findings from the brief. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shruti, and it's lovely to be with you all today. If you could just go to the next slide, please. So just as an overview and following up on what Shruti was mentioning, community mobilization is a really important strategy to unpack because it's seen as one of the most promising strategies to transform harmful attitudes, beliefs, and norms underlying violence against women and girls and gender inequality. And it's also extremely popular. I think it was one of the most popular strategies used across the UN Trust-funded portfolio. And it's often regarded as one of the best strategies for creating more enabling environments. They typically engage volunteer community activists who live or work in communities and are trained and supported to engage communities in informal conversations and awareness raising about violence. And these approaches typically also work with a range of actors, including religious and traditional leaders. And so it's great to have these two topics together today, as well as the police, health, and social services. However, the evidence on the effectiveness of community mobilization to reduce violence against women and girls is mixed. There have been some very rigorous randomized control trials, for example, that have shown that community mobilization can be effective to reduce violence against women and girls at the entire community level. However, other evaluations have found no impact. And so I think more documentation of what are the processes of change in response to community mobilization, what are the implementation and contextual factors that help enable effective and sustainable community mobilization across different settings is really important. And where this, I think, practice brief and this knowledge can really contribute to the evidence. So next slide, please. So this synthesis review really does aim to contribute to this evidence gap by highlighting the different processes and implementation of very different types of community mobilization to prevent violence against women and girls across very different settings. And this is based on 10 different projects funded by the UN Trust Fund, based on analyzing and documenting some of the practice-based knowledge. These 10 projects also have a broad scope of type of violence against women and girls that they're preventing and types of community mobilization activities, and really in doing so represent the breadth of work that exists in this field. Next slide, please. So before I go into the findings, I wanted to note that we took inspiration and organized the findings from a framework developed by Kathy Campbell and Flora Cornish, which is a conceptual framework for community mobilization. And this framework demonstrates that the success or failure of community mobilization interventions is dependent on how these interventions interact with the symbolic context. So this includes the social, cultural norms of a community, and in this case, kind of cultural meanings associated with violence against women and girls, as well as the economic and other incentives for community engagement. So thinking about the material context. And finally, the relationship context. So this includes relationships and networks between and within communities, as well as among community members and more powerful allies. And this brief also adds the institutional context, which was expanded by Manel and Dadswell to this framework, recognizing that community mobilization should also ideally allow communities to challenge broader social and institutional structures that influence our efforts to prevent violence against women and girls at a community level. And so I just wanted to introduce this framework, which I'll now talk through to give some very kind of rapid highlights from the findings. So next slide, please. So starting at the symbolic level, there was a lot of important insights linked to this, and practitioners across the board noted that effective community mobilization interventions, it's critical that they're culturally relevant, that they're appropriate to their particular context, and that they're tailored really carefully to what are the key priorities and needs within communities that they are working with. Many practitioners noted that it was important to find appropriate community entry points. So these things include things like, how do we talk about violence? What are the values that we associate with our activities? And this was really important to gain trust and also avoid potential backlash against this kind of work. Also, many practitioners across a number of projects identified how community mobilization should encourage community members to critically reflect on harmful social norms underlying violence and help develop alternative, healthier norms. And that this can be a really powerful tool to do this really important work. Insights from the 10 projects very clearly emphasize that change at the symbolic level is not easy. It takes time, it takes frequent and intensive engagement. It's not something through a kind of once-off workshop. And so really kind of comes back to the importance of ensuring long-term engagement and being embedded in communities to ensure change at this level. And another really important insight around the symbolic level was that community mobilization should support organizations and activists to kind of walk the walk in terms of are they representing and showing commitment to the values that they are disseminating in their communities. And part of this includes appropriate selection, training, and support of community activists and frontline staff. So next slide, please. So if we talk now about more of the material context, many practitioners, interestingly, identified the importance to include economic empowerment activities in community mobilization projects, given that in many of these settings, economic or socioeconomic factors were key risk factors for violence against women and girls, or could prevent full engagement in community mobilization programming. And one particular material consideration that came up was thinking about resource-based agency of activists. And this means thinking through promoting volunteer activism, but also ensuring that activists are not financially burdened or that they are not hindered from engaging in activist activities because it's expected that they're volunteers. And so this brings up a really important consideration of trade-offs of being both volunteers and being perceived as volunteers, which could be quite important to their legitimacy, but also ensuring that they are not financially burdened and that they are compensated to do the work. Ongoing training and mentoring of activists was also seen as important to allow them to put their knowledge and skills into action. And this is conceptualized in the framework by Campbell and Cornish as experience-based agency. So it's not just enough to kind of, ask community activists to go into their communities. It's really important to give them ongoing mentorship, knowledge, skills that they can have more experience and feel more empowered to do this really important work. And some projects emphasize the importance of thinking about how to also allow participants to have experience-based agency. A major theme that came up was identifying and working with key gatekeepers that might hinder people, activists, or participants engaging with this work. So for example, if you're working with schools, the need to potentially work with teachers and parents, or if you're working at community activism level, the need to potentially work with village leaders. And so identifying who are the key gatekeepers power and hinder participants or activists from engaging. Next slide, please. So there was also this, the relational level, and many of the practitioner-based insights centered on the importance of engagement both across and within different community groups in order to what is known as bonding social capital. And many practitioners noted that meaningful engagement of communities in design and implementation of mobilization programs requires relationship building, which takes time, trust, and mutual respect, that this is a key part of effective mobilization activities. Many practitioners noted it's important to not treat communities as homogenous, as one kind of community, but recognize the intersectionalities within communities and try to ensure that the mobilization efforts leave no one behind. And participatory processes, adaptive programming, and targeting different stakeholders with different approaches could help ensure that no one is left behind. And then finally, at this level, there was thinking about more bridging social capital. So collaborating with stakeholders who hold power and influence, including religious, traditional leaders, and governments, was identified by many practitioners as necessary to foster a more enabling environment for this work. And it is also really important to bridge access to response services within the community and beyond, as raising awareness of violence against women and girls may lead to an increase in demand for services. And interestingly, many projects noted that women might initially seek informal support, showing that it is really important to equip staff and activists and community leaders to respond to survivors, as they might be the kind of frontline support. Next slide, please. So finally, the last dimension of this framework that we're using to organize the findings is the institutional level. And some practitioners did identify the importance of holding governments and institutions accountable to establish and implement policies and laws on violence against women and girls and gender equality. And for some projects, linking community mobilization efforts to relevant government plans and policies was really effective and could be helpful to build credibility, to link it to advocacy efforts, and also ensure sustainability of this work. This was also, I would say, the most challenging level for organizations involved in this brief to work at, especially for smaller organizations or projects that had a more narrow scope and local focus. And some kind of advice or experiences from practitioners was that focusing on maybe one or two institutions or establishing partnerships with other organizations who could be supportive could be helpful to work at this level more effectively. Next slide, please. So as Shruti mentioned, throughout this brief, we've also noted how community mobilization efforts had to adapt to the COVID pandemic, as this brief was written and analyzed, and also through speaking with practitioners during the crisis. And projects shared quite important lessons from the pandemic, including potentially switching to meet basic needs of community members to help protect them from the virus. Things like distributing personal protective equipment or offering livelihood activities or distributing food parcels. And that this was again in line with community mobilization as responding to community priorities and needs. Some practitioners noted how the pandemic highlighted earlier calls to better support the well-being and resilience of staff, activists, and others who are leading efforts to prevent violence against women and girls. For some projects, it was important to pivot towards a stronger focus on response, although they typically worked on prevention. And this included providing referral information and working with local leaders and service providers. And again, as an example of efforts adapting to the community needs and priorities amidst the COVID pandemic. And many practitioners noted the challenges of adapting mobilization efforts to the pandemic. For instance, a lot of work had to be moved online or to much smaller groups, and this could limit interactions or be a very new area for practitioners to be engaging in. But many practitioners noted the importance of still trying to find ways to make more participatory engagement. So such as things of WhatsApp groups or digital radio, and still trying to come back to the tenets of community mobilization, which is informal conversation, two-way dialogue, and that still adapting to online required coming back to those key roots of what makes this methodology work. So finally, I'm going to turn to the recommendations. And next slide, please, that came out of this brief. So firstly, in terms of recommendations for practitioners implementing community mobilization programs, it came up really clearly of the importance to know your community, to know your response, and that the appropriateness and relevance of community mobilization strategies and messages varies widely and should vary from one setting to another. The second is ensuring community volunteers or activists are not overburdened, but are carefully selected, trained, and supported. They need to have gender equitable and nonviolent attitudes and behaviors and be committed as activists. And it's important to note that some financial support may be necessary to ensure they are not burdened or excluded because of lack of financial means. The third is to strive for reflexivity and accountability on behalf of organizations. Community mobilization should really start from within, and staff should be encouraged to connect on a personal level with the issues at hand. It's also important to address inequitable power dynamics with community members. Fourthly, this takes time, so ensure sufficient time and intensity to have an impact. And addressing harmful norms, attitudes, and beliefs is a process that we know takes time and intensity, and this work confirms that. Fifthly, work at the nexus of violence prevention and response. So it's critical that community mobilization programs ensure support for survivors through things like establishing referral links or partnerships, and by working with providers to improve existing services. 6 is to foster adaptive programming. Community mobilization should be demand-driven and adapt to community priorities, and ideally be co-created with communities. And adaptive programming keeps the work relevant and helps by doing so to foster trust and respect with communities, which is really the crux of mobilization work. And the final recommendation for practitioners is make efforts to support a more enabling environment. So this includes identifying and working with opinion leaders and gatekeepers. It also includes advocacy, engagement, and or training to hold governments and institutions accountable to commitments, and linking efforts to local or national policies and plans. Next slide, please. I'll finally just talk about the key recommendations for donors that came out of this brief. The first is to ensure longer-term flexible funding to accommodate adaptive programming, which can ensure responsiveness and co-creation with communities. And community mobilization processes take time and warrant funding for at least 3 to 5 years. The second is to foster a culture of learning, to encourage reflection on what works as much as what is not working. And this is especially important when it comes to community mobilization, which is complex and challenging with impacts that can be hard to measure. So donors should encourage grantees to account for this complexity rather than trying to simplify the process. And finally, donors should fund and support civil society organizations and women's rights organizations to do community mobilization work. These actors are very well placed to build relationships with community members and are typically grounded in communities, and so can ensure more relevant, appropriate, and accessible programming. And finally, for researchers. So I think more research is needed that acknowledges how community mobilization plays out differently in different contexts. I think secondly, research should document lessons learned through practice-based knowledge and enable partnerships between practitioners and researchers to ensure sharing and acknowledgement of different forms of expertise and knowledge. And I think this is a recommendation throughout these series of briefs. And finally, I think more research to investigate how to best support volunteerism among activists and what role this has in achieving and sustaining results. This came up as a key kind of challenge and area to further explore for many practitioners. Thank you so much.